and how additional layers now influence how land governance is governed in practice. One second. As Rita outlined, ownership now exists within a broader governance environment where multiple institutions influence how land is used and managed. Many landowners feel this shift even if they don't yet fully explain it. People still hold legal title to their land, but the meaning of control has changed. Ownership has become separate from authority, and the rules beneath us are no longer the rules many of us grew up with. My role tonight is to examine how a series of policy, legislative, and institutional developments have interacted with that system, and how those interactions are shaping outcomes across land use, approvals, and governance. The forces that Rita outlined did not simply appear. The purpose of this analysis is to examine how several institutional developments affecting land governance in British Columbia may interact within the province's broader property system. These developments include the modernization of the Provincial Land Title Registry, the implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA, and evolving jurisprudence concerning Aboriginal title under Section 35 of the Constitutional Act of 1982. Taken individually, each of these developments may appear technical or administrative, but when they begin operating together, they shape how authority over land is exercised within this province. Understanding that interaction is essential if landowners, farmers, businesses, and communities are going to navigate the system that is emerging. The forces that Rita described were created through a sequence of global declarations, national policy decisions, and provincial legislation that now interacts in a way no other jurisdiction in the world attempted. That sequence did not begin with UNDRIP. It began earlier in 1992 with the United Nations Rio Earth Summit, which produced Agenda 21. Agenda 21 reframed land resources and development as matters of coordinating stakeholder governance implemented through local authorities. To understand what is happening to property governance, approvals, and long-term certainty in British Columbia, we need to begin with what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, actually is. UNDRIP was developed or adopted by the United Nations in 2007 as a global framework of principles. It was not law. It was not enforceable. It was intended as moral guidance outlining how governments should treat Indigenous peoples with respect, dignity, and fairness. Around the world, countries endorsed DRIPA symbolically, but they did not turn it into legislation. Australia did not legislate. New Zealand did not legislate it. Norway, Sweden, Finland did not legislate it. These countries all recognized the same risk. Turning a broad aspirational declaration into statutory law could destabilize existing legal frameworks, create overlapping authorities, and undermine certainty around property and governance. British Columbia, however, chose a different path. In 2019, the province passed a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Next slide. The legislation required that every existing and future provincial law be aligned with UNDRIP. DRIPA does not define what alignment means. It does not establish guardrails. It does not provide clear conflict resolution mechanisms. Instead, interpretation is left up to ministries, regulators, and the courts. And Rita spoke about how we now have an industrial complex surrounding the legal system. Canada later passed the federal UNDRIP legislation through Bill C-15 in 2021. But British Columbia remains the only jurisdiction on earth to embed UNDRIP directly into its provincial legal system. To understand why these developments carry legal weight, we also need to understand Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Section 35 provides that constitutional foundation that allows courts to interpret how Indigenous land rights interact with provincial laws and policies. Section 35 recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of Indigenous peoples of Canada. Because Section 35 sits inside the Constitution, those rights carry constitutional protection and must be considered wherever governments make decisions affecting land resources or governance. Over time, Canadian courts have interpreted Section 35 to include Aboriginal title, meaning that Indigenous lands rights can exist alongside other forms of land ownership recognized under provincial law. This is important because when constitutional rights and the provincial property system interact, courts may be asked to determine how these different legal interests can coexist. Once UNDRIP is made operational through provincial legislation like DRIPA, it does more than change policy inside of British Columbia. It creates court precedent within the British Columbia and establishes persuasive authority beyond it. Under common law, courts in other provinces are not required to follow British Columbia decisions, but they may rely on them to interpret similar issues. That means British Columbia has become a reference point for how UNDRIP is applied in practice. As these interpretations are cited and adapted, they can influence how UNDRIP is implemented across the rest of Canada and through the shared legal traditions in other Western nations. In that sense, this is not only a British Columbia issue. It is an early test case for broader implications. This happened because British Columbia sits on a unique constitutional foundation. Unlike most Western democracies, Canada does not constitutionally protect private property rights. Property was deliberately excluded from the Canadian Charter of Rights, Freedoms, leaving land ownership subject to provincial legislation rather than entrenched constitutional protection. Provincial and land systems, therefore, do not carry the same constitutional guarantees that exist in the United States, Australia, and much of Europe, so we have less protection. And because roughly 92 to 95% of British Columbia is legally classified as unceded territory, the reach of DRIPA extends into almost every sector of provincial governance. Once DRIPA became law, every single ministry in British Columbia was required to reinterpret its mandate. The Ministries of Indigenous Relations assumed a central coordinating role. The Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship began redesigning approval systems. Forestry, mining, agriculture, zoning, transportation, emergency management, and infrastructure agencies all adjusted their procedures to demonstrate alignment. None of this was broadly debated in public, yet the effects are now appearing everywhere. A decision of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, released in August of 2025, but widely reported in the news later that fall, involved the Cowichan tribes and addressed land in Richmond. The courts confirmed that the Aboriginal title exists as a prior constitutional interest and clarified that Aboriginal title is legally senior to fee simple ownership. Most recently, public attention has also been drawn to agreements and policy decisions involving the Musqueam Indian Band and the Government of Canada concerning the cooperative governance of over fisheries, marine stewardship, and emergency management in the Fraser River region. This geographic overlay is not incidental. The Richmond lands referenced in the Cowichan decision sit within the lower mainland in the mouth of the Fraser River, while the Musqueam Indian Band has long-standing territorial and government interests connecting to the same river system and surrounding air lands. Although these developments arise through different legal mechanisms, one one through a jurisdictional ruling and the other through a negotiated agreement involving the Musqueam and federal government, they illustrate the same broader pattern. Aboriginal rights and title are increasingly treated as continuing constitutional interests that operate alongside existing land ownership. Private title remains in place, but governance authority over the land, water, and resources increasingly involve multiple institutions operating together. When ownership and decision-making authority no longer sit in the same place, property begins to function differently than most people assume. This is the practical meaning of the shift that we described earlier. Ownership remains, but authority no longer rests in place. Homeowners still have title, but they no longer hold sole authority over how that land can be governed. And we've seen those regulations slowly changing and our rights to our property being eroded by regulations and municipal everything. So it's been a long process, and this is basically basically handing over or taking away all your rights, and the government's going to tell you what you can do with your land. And that eventually the neighbors are going to make the final decision what you can do and what you can or can't do with your property. Homeowners still have their title. I said that. Businesses experience this through deploying approvals and inconsistent regulatory outcomes. Farmers experience it through land use uncertainty, drainage approvals, watershed governance, and financing challenges. Municipalities experience it through zoning conflicts, shifting tax bases, and expanding provincial oversights. These outcomes are the result of embedding an international declaration into provincial law without clearly defining the boundaries, timeline, or transition mechanisms. No other jurisdiction was willing to take the risk. British Columbia now stands alone inside a governance experiment with no clear roadmap and no defined end state. These changes are not abstract. They affect emergency response, flood management, water allocation, drainage rights, transportation corridors, and agricultural land use. They determine how authority in a crisis, who controls water flows, who grants permits, and who decides whether a community can rebuild. Now we're seeing, after a flood or some emerging events, a lot of people aren't able to rebuild or go back to their property. Be prepared to see more of that. The purpose of understanding this framework is not to assign blame. It is to recognize how authority now moves to landowners and communities. Sorry, it is to recognize how authority now moves to so landowners and communities can engage the system in how it actually operates. Because once governance authority becomes layered across multiple institutions, the implications extend far beyond property law. They begin to affect every sector that depends on land: agriculture, food production, water management, environmental regulation, emergency response. For farmers in particular, these governance shifts are not theoretical. They appear in everyday decisions that determine how land can be used, how water flows are managed, how drainage systems operate, and how agricultural businesses are allowed to continue operating. And in recent years, one of the most visible examples that expanding regulatory environment has emerged through the federal response to avian influenza, commonly known as H5N1. Across Canada, farmers have encountered quarantine zones, livestock management directives, biosecurity enforcement, and expanding federal authority exercised during disease outbreaks. These developments highlight how regulatory authority over agriculture, animal health, and food production is also becoming layered across multiple institutions. Understanding that connection is essential. Agriculture does not exist in isolation. It operates on land. It depends on water. It depends on regulatory approval. And its foundation within that same governance structure that shape property systems more broadly. So when authority over land begins to shift, it is not surprising that authority over agricultural production begins to shift as well. The next part of our tonight's discussion will focus on one of the areas where these governance dynamics become most visible in practice, because the same environment that influences land use and approvals is also shaping how agricultural risk is defined, how disease response frameworks are applied, and how regulatory authority is exercised over independent farms. Understanding that connection is essential. What follows will provide additional context and perspective on how these dynamics are being experienced in real world conditions, including a closer look on the situation involving the universal ostrich farm. Thank you.